Summer 1944, Biak Island in the Southwest Pacific. A 42-year-old civilian in a plain khaki shirt climbs into the cockpit of a Lockheed P-38 Lightning. He holds no military rank and possesses no official combat authorization. To the administration in Washington, he is one of the most politically toxic figures in America. Yet this civilian technician is preparing to fly into an active war zone alongside veteran Army Air Forces pilots. He is there to show combat-hardened aviators how to achieve a mechanical impossibility, stretching the fuel range of their twin-engine fighters hundreds of miles beyond the manufacturer's absolute limits. The man in that cockpit was Charles Lindbergh. Just 3 years prior, his fierce, highly publicized America First isolationism had infuriated President Franklin D. Roosevelt, resulting in a bitter public feud that effectively barred Lindbergh from active military service once the war began. Prevented from wearing a uniform, the world's most famous aviator had to navigate a bureaucratic loophole, deploying to the Pacific Theater strictly as a civilian technical representative for United Aircraft. He was operating entirely outside the rigid military chain of command, a political outcast embedded among skeptical, battle-weary squadrons. This is the story of how a civilian exile managed to fundamentally rewrite the operating manuals of the United States Army Air Forces during a critical phase of the island-hopping campaign. It is an investigation into the intersection of engineering physics, logistical friction, and combat survival. How does a man, strictly forbidden from engaging the enemy, convince veteran combat pilots to completely change how they operate their complex machines, asking them to deliberately run their engines on the razor's edge of stalling over thousands of miles of open ocean? By solving this high-stakes mechanical puzzle, Lindbergh would help unlock the unforgiving geography of the Pacific, permanently altering the tactical geometry of the Allied air war. But to understand why his intervention was even necessary, and why theater commanders were desperate enough to look the other way while a political pariah climbed into a frontline fighter, we first have to look at the invisible wall the American military had crashed into by the middle of 1944. The invisible wall confronting the American military in the middle of 1944 was forged entirely by geography. In the Southwest Pacific area, General George Kenney's 5th Air Force was locked in a brutal logistical reality. Unlike the aerial campaign in Europe, where targets were often separated by mere hundreds of miles of landmass, the Pacific was a vast, unforgiving void of open ocean dotted with heavily fortified atolls. General Douglas MacArthur's strategy of leapfrogging across the map, bypassing Japanese strongholds to sever their supply lines, relied on the reach of American air power. If the bombers could not reach the next target, the ground forces could not advance. But sending heavy bombers deep into Japanese airspace without fighter protection was a recipe for slaughter. Unescorted bomber formations were routinely shredded by agile Japanese Zeros and Oscars. To survive, the bombers required a shield, a fighter escort capable of flying all the way to the target, engaging in high-speed, fuel-guzzling dogfights, and safely returning to base. This geographical tyranny made the Lockheed P-38 Lightning the most prized asset in the Pacific Theater. Its twin-boom design and heavy nose armament made it a lethal machine. But more importantly, its 2 liquid-cooled Allison engines provided an indispensable psychological and practical safety net. In the Pacific, an engine failure in a single-engine fighter did not mean a parachute drop into a French farmer's field. It meant ditching in a boundless, shark-infested ocean, where exposure or capture meant almost certain death. A twin-engine fighter could take battle damage or suffer mechanical failure and still limp home on one functioning propeller. Yet, the P-38 was fundamentally shackled by its fuel gauges. Standard United States Army Air Forces operating procedures dictated a rigid set of engine settings that burned through aviation gas at an alarming rate. Adhering to the manufacturer's flight manuals, an American pilot could expect an effective combat radius of roughly 400 miles. They could fly out, fight a brief, chaotic 15-minute engagement at maximum power, and return with just enough reserve fuel to account for unpredictable, shifting weather fronts. 400 miles was a formidable distance, but it was not enough. As the front line pushed toward the Philippines, the distances between Allied airstrips and primary Japanese targets stretched to 600, 700, and even 800 miles. The American advance was tethered to a 400-mile leash. If Kenny's fighters could not escort the bombers over places like Balikpapan or Mindanao, the bombers could not fly. The entire strategic timetable of the Pacific War risked grinding to a halt. The military bureaucracy, however, was terrified of experimenting with the highly sensitive Allison engines in an active combat zone. Official flight manuals were written by conservative engineers back in the United States, designed primarily to protect the machinery from catastrophic wear. The prevailing dogma of the Army Air Forces dictated that pilots must run their engines at high RPMs and relatively rich fuel mixtures. The liquid-cooled Allisons were complex, highly tuned beasts, and operating them outside the prescribed parameters was widely believed to invite disaster. Running an engine too lean, or at the wrong ratio of engine speed to throttle pressure, was thought to cause severe overheating, pre-ignition, and violent detonation within the cylinders. In short, the manual warned that deviating from established settings would blow the engines apart mid-flight. For a squadron commander responsible for the lives of his men, these manuals were the absolute law. No commanding officer was willing to order his pilots to deliberately defy the manufacturer's safety guidelines while flying hundreds of miles over hostile waters. The mechanical risk was deemed too great. Following the book meant the engines survived, even if the mission failed because of fuel starvation. Ignoring the book was viewed as a reckless gamble with a pilot's life. The 5th Air Force was trapped in a bureaucratic and mechanical dead end. His arrival in the Pacific Theater in the spring of 1944 was a massive political headache for the military brass. Prior to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Charles Lindbergh had been the most vocal, influential, and controversial spokesman for the America First Committee, vigorously campaigning to keep the United States out of the European War. His speeches infuriated the Roosevelt administration, leading the president to publicly question his loyalty and compare him to a copperhead, a Civil War-era traitor. In response, Lindbergh angrily resigned his commission as a colonel in the Army Air Corps. Once the war began, his offers to re-enlist were coldly and repeatedly rejected by the White House. The world's most famous aviator was effectively blacklisted by his own government. Determined to contribute to the war effort, Lindbergh had to circumvent the military establishment entirely. He secured a position as a civilian technical representative for United Aircraft Corporation, the manufacturer of the F-4U Corsair. Under this civilian guise, he deployed to the South Pacific to study fighter performance under combat conditions. While evaluating Marine Corsair squadrons, Lindbergh's obsession with fuel efficiency naturally drew his attention to the Army's P-38s, operating in the adjacent Southwest Pacific area. For General George Kinney and Theater Commander Douglas MacArthur, allowing Lindbergh into their operational zone was a severe political risk. Washington had made it abundantly clear that Lindbergh was persona non grata. He held no military rank, carried no official authority, and was explicitly forbidden from engaging the enemy or firing his weapons in combat. If Lindbergh were to be shot down or killed while participating in an unauthorized combat mission, the ensuing political scandal would bring the wrath of the Roosevelt administration crashing down on MacArthur and Kenny. Yet Kenny was a pragmatist. He was facing an intractable logistical crisis, and the man standing in front of him, regardless of his political baggage, possessed an unparalleled, almost instinctual understanding of aviation engineering. Lindbergh wasn't just a famous pilot, he was a pioneer of long-distance flight who would spend his entire career calculating fuel consumption down to the last drop. Kenny needed a miracle to stretch his fighter escorts to the Philippines. He quietly authorized Lindbergh to embed with his frontline P-38 squadrons as an observer, issuing strict, albeit completely unenforceable orders that the civilian was not to shoot at Japanese aircraft. As Lindbergh integrated himself into units like the famed 475th Fighter Group, he began to analyze prevailing fuel consumption rates. Flying alongside veteran Army pilots on long, grueling patrols, he observed how strictly they adhered to conservative Army flight manuals. He studied the temperatures, the fuel flow, and the behavior of the Allison engines in the humid, turbulent air of the tropics. To Lindbergh's methodical engineering mind, the military was burning vast amounts of fuel unnecessarily, artificially limiting the reach of their own aircraft because they were too afraid of their own engines. He spent days running calculations and quietly testing the limits of the P-38 on local flights, operating entirely outside the boundaries of official technical orders. He was developing a radical baseline for engine management that defied everything Army pilots had been taught. Diagnosing a mechanical inefficiency was one thing. Convincing hardened combat veterans to adopt it was an entirely different challenge. These were men who flew through anti-aircraft fire and tangled with Zeros on a daily basis. They trusted their training, they trusted their manuals, and above all, they trusted the heavy, comforting roar of an engine running exactly the way they expected it to. When the civilian finally presented his unorthodox solution to the seasoned fighter pilots, outlining a method of flying that deliberately ignored every established safety protocol regarding engine RPM and fuel mixture, the reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly hostile. To young combat aviators who had already survived the worst the Pacific had to offer, Charles Lindbergh didn't sound like a visionary engineer offering salvation. He sounded like a madman who was trying to kill them. The breakthrough did not happen in the adrenaline-fueled chaos of a dogfight. It happened inside a sweltering, austere briefing tent on a coral dust airstrip, standing before the gathered pilots of the 475th Fighter Group. The aviators sat with their arms crossed, sweating in the tropical heat, staring at the 42-year-old civilian in the plain khaki shirt who was calmly telling them to unlearn everything they knew about flying a combat aircraft. Lindbergh stood at the blackboard and outlined a fuel management strategy forged not in the military, but drawn from his deep background in commercial aviation. Long before the war, he had mapped out transoceanic routes for Pan American Airways, where fuel efficiency meant the difference between a successful routine flight and a catastrophe. He knew how to nurse an engine over vast, empty distances. But to the men in the tent, applying commercial airline physics to a high-performance fighter plane sounded completely suicidal. The standard Army manuals dictated running the P-38's twin Allison engines at a comfortable 2,600 revolutions per minute to maintain a safe, highly responsive power band. Lindbergh told them to drop it. He instructed the pilots to throttle their engines down to an agonizingly slow 1,600 revolutions per minute. Simultaneously, he told them to significantly increase the manifold pressure, essentially forcing a much heavier load of air and fuel vapor into the combustion chambers. Finally, he ordered them to pull back the mixture controls, leaning out the aviation gas almost to the exact point of engine starvation. To the veteran pilots and the seasoned Army mechanics listening in the back of the tent, this high-torque, low-speed configuration was pure mechanical heresy. Every instinct, every hour of their military training screamed that this was a fatal error. The prevailing dogma warned that imposing such immense pressure on the cylinders while the engine was turning that slowly would cause violent pre-ignition. The fuel would detonate unevenly. They were absolutely convinced that running this extremely lean mixture over the Pacific would cause the cylinder heads to blow, instantly tearing the delicate Allison engines apart mid-flight. They weren't just skeptical, they were horrified. Lindbergh recognized that equations on a blackboard were never going to override the sheer terror of an engine failing over shark-infested waters. He had to prove the math in the air. He asked for a plane. Taking a borrowed Lightning, Lindbergh launched alongside a formation of Army pilots for a grueling multi-hour patrol. As the flight pushed far out over the featureless ocean, the military aviators operated strictly by the book, watching their fuel gauges drop at the expected alarming rate. Lindbergh, flying in the exact same formation, methodically pulled back his throttles. He dropped the RPMs until the twin engines took on a deep, sluggish, unnatural drone. He leaned the mixture until the engines were practically gasping, riding the razor's edge of a stall. Hours later, the formation banked back toward the island and touched down on the crushed coral runway. The combat pilots taxied in, their fuel tanks nearly dry, operating with the narrowest of safety margins. But when the ground crews climbed onto Lindbergh's wings and dipped the measuring rods into his fuel cells, the mechanics stopped and stared. Lindbergh had returned with hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel still sloshing in his tanks. It was not a marginal gain. He had practically doubled the effective range of the aircraft without adding a single drop of extra gas. The physical evidence was undeniable, instantly shattering the squadron's entrenched skepticism. Yet demonstrating the physics on one airplane was only the beginning. The civilian had proven that the engines would not explode and that the math worked perfectly. But to fundamentally alter the tactical geometry of the Pacific War, Lindbergh now had to teach this dangerous, nerve-wracking trick to an entire air force. To institutionalize this radical mechanical philosophy across the 5th Air Force, Lindbergh could not rely on classroom lectures or distributed memos. The psychological barrier was simply too high. For a 20-year-old fighter pilot, the physical sensation of intentionally starving a high-performance engine of fuel while flying over an unforgiving ocean was deeply unnatural. To convince the men, Lindbergh had to become a flying instructor on the front lines. He began systematically rotating through the veteran P-38 squadrons of the Southwest Pacific. First, the 475th Fighter Group, then the 8th, then the 49th, embedding himself not as a visiting dignitary, but as a silent wingman. He would brief the pilots on the crushed coral airstrips, map out the precise throttle and mixture settings on a chalkboard, and then climb into a borrowed Lightning to fly alongside them on actual, grueling combat patrols. The airborne classroom was a nerve-wracking environment. High above the Pacific, suspended in the cramped, greenhouse-like canopy of a P-38, the young Army aviators would listen to Lindbergh's calm, level voice over the crackling radio network, instructing them to do the unthinkable. Flying in tight formation, Lindbergh would talk them through the sequence step by step. First, they were told to adjust the propeller pitch, dropping the engine speed from the standard, comforting roar of 2,200 or 2,600 revolutions per minute down to a staggering 1,600 revolutions per minute. The auditory shift alone was terrifying. The high-pitched, aggressive scream of the twin, liquid-cooled Allisons suddenly plummeted into a deep, sluggish, vibrating thrum. To a fighter pilot, an engine sounding this slow instinctively signaled an imminent stall or catastrophic mechanical failure. The aircraft felt heavy, its nose suddenly sluggish, the vibrations rattling through the control yoke and up the pilot's arms. Then came the second, even more counterintuitive step. While the engines were barely turning over at this agonizingly slow speed, Lindbergh instructed them to push the throttles forward, significantly increasing the manifold pressure. They were effectively cramming a massive load of highly compressed air into the cylinders of an engine that was barely spinning. The Army's technical manuals warned that this exact combination, high pressure at low RPM, would inevitably cause violent pre-ignition, blowing the cylinder heads right off the engine block. Yet, as the pilots hesitantly inched their throttles forward, bracing for the concussive shudder of an exploding engine, nothing happened. The Allisons absorbed the pressure. Finally, the most delicate adjustment, the mixture control. Lindbergh had them pull back the fuel mixture levers, leaning out the aviation gas almost to the point of total starvation. They were now running the powerful military fighter like a long-haul commercial airliner, riding the absolute razor's edge of the engine's operating tolerance. For the first few hours, the pilots flew with white-knuckled grips, staring obsessively at their temperature gauges, expecting the coolant lines to boil over or the oil pressure to collapse. But the needles held steady. The engines continued their low, monotonous drone, and as the hours ticked by, the true miracle of Lindbergh's intervention slowly revealed itself on the instrument panel. The fuel gauges, which normally plummeted with anxiety-inducing speed, seemed to have practically frozen in place. The physical results were staggering. By adopting Lindbergh's commercial cruise settings, the P-38 Lightnings were suddenly sipping fuel at a fraction of their normal rate. A fighter that previously burned through roughly 100 gallons of aviation gas an hour was suddenly consuming closer to 50 or 60 gallons. In a matter of weeks, the effective combat radius of the American fighter squadrons expanded by nearly 50%. The invisible 400-mile wall that had constrained General Douglas MacArthur's advance was shattered overnight. Now, the Lightnings could comfortably reach out to 600, 650, and eventually over 700 miles from their bases, fight a prolonged engagement at maximum power, and still have enough reserve fuel to navigate around the violent tropical thunderstorms that frequently blocked their route home. This newfound endurance completely altered the tactical geometry of the air war. The heavy bomber squadrons, the B-24 Liberators that had previously been forced to turn back or face slaughter without escort, now had an impenetrable shield that could follow them all the way to the most distant targets. It wasn't just about distance, it was about the luxury of time. P-38s could now loiter over a target area for an hour or more, hunting targets of opportunity, suppressing anti-aircraft positions, and waiting to escort the slower bombers back through hostile airspace. The American fighter forces were suddenly untethered, and the shockwave of this mechanical revelation was about to violently crash into the Imperial Japanese military. For the Japanese commanders garrisoning the outer perimeter of their fading empire in the Dutch East Indies and the southern Philippines, the sudden change in American capabilities was incomprehensible. Up to this point in the war, Japanese military intelligence had a precise, highly accurate understanding of the Lockheed P-38's operational limits. They knew exactly how far an American fighter could fly from its bases in New Guinea or Biak Island. Based on this knowledge, the Japanese had established a complex, supposedly secure, network of rear-echelon logistical hubs. Bases in the Halmahera Islands, on Ceram, and deep in Mindanao were considered absolute safe zones. Here, Japanese aviation units rested their pilots, conducted major aircraft repairs, and staged massive shipping convoys, completely confident that they were operating hundreds of miles beyond the reach of American fighter escorts. They knew that if American bombers appeared, they would be unescorted and highly vulnerable to interception by agile Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars and Mitsubishi Zeros. That sense of security evaporated in the summer of 1944. Without warning, heavily armed formations of twin-engine Lightnings began materializing out of the clouds over bases that Japanese commanders believed were untouchable. The ambushes were devastating. Japanese fighters, caught completely by surprise and often caught warming up on the ground or climbing slowly to altitude, were mercilessly cut down. The American pilots, flush with excess fuel, engaged in aggressive, sustained dogfights deep in Japanese territory, utilizing the P-38's superior speed and heavy nose armament to shred the surprised defenders. The psychological impact on the Japanese forces was profound. The fundamental rules of engagement had changed overnight. Ground crews watched in horror as American fighters swept low over pristine airfields, strafing rows of parked bombers and setting fuel dumps ablaze. Convoys that had anchored in previously safe harbors were suddenly subjected to relentless, low-level strafing runs. The entire Japanese logistical network, which relied heavily on the presumption of safe staging areas, began to unravel. They were forced to pull their aircraft and ships even further back, conceding vast swaths of airspace and sea lanes to the advancing Allies. The Japanese commanders could not understand how the Americans had achieved this. There had been no new aircraft model introduced, no massive leap in fuel tank technology that their spies had detected. The enemy had simply, inexplicably, bent the map to their will. But while the frontline squadrons celebrated their newfound reach and the Japanese military reeled from the sudden collapse of their defensive perimeter, a profound escalating anxiety was taking root within General George Kenney's headquarters. As combat reports filed in from the distant strikes over Halmahera and the Philippines, the 5th Air Force Command Staff began to realize the sheer scale of the physical risks their civilian instructor was taking. Charles Lindbergh was not merely demonstrating his fuel-saving techniques on safe, local check flights. To prove his methods under the most extreme conditions, he was actively flying on deep penetration combat missions. He was routinely crossing into fiercely defended airspace, flying 8, sometimes 9-hour patrols over thousands of miles of hostile ocean. For the military brass, this was a waking nightmare. Lindbergh was still an uncommissioned civilian. He was legally forbidden from carrying a weapon or firing his aircraft's guns in combat, operating under a strict, unofficial, gentleman's agreement with General Kenney. But headquarters knew that Japanese anti-aircraft gunners and fighter pilots did not care about the bureaucratic status of the man in the cockpit. If Lindbergh's engine caught a stray bullet, or if the unpredictable tropical weather forced him to ditch into the sea, the consequences would be catastrophic. The political calculus was terrifying. President Franklin Roosevelt still viewed Lindbergh as a dangerous isolationist and a political enemy. If the world's most famous aviator were to be shot down and killed while participating in unauthorized combat missions orchestrated by 5th Air Force Command, the ensuing scandal would be seismic. The press would have a field day, demanding to know why a banned civilian was allowed to fly a frontline fighter in a combat zone. Heads would roll, and careers, potentially including those of Kenney and MacArthur, would be abruptly terminated. Even worse was the prospect of capture. If Lindbergh were forced to bail out over a Japanese-held island, he would instantly become the most high-profile prisoner of war in human history. The propaganda value for Tokyo would be immeasurable. They would parade the great American hero before cameras, a symbol of American vulnerability, while the Roosevelt administration would be forced into a humiliating public spectacle trying to explain his presence in the Pacific. Despite frantic, hushed conversations among the command staff, Kenney found himself paralyzed. He could not ground Lindbergh. The civilians' fuel-saving techniques were the only thing keeping the island-hopping campaign on schedule. The entire strategic advance toward the Philippines now depended entirely on the fact that P-38 pilots were flying according to Lindbergh's commercial airline metrics. The military was trapped in a desperate paradox. They were terrified of the political fallout if Lindbergh was killed, but they were equally reliant on his daily presence in the combat zone to keep their offensive alive. The front line had been completely transformed, but this miraculous, war-altering innovation exposed a massive, embarrassing failure within the American military machine itself. The underlying truth behind this failure was that Lindbergh had not actually invented this fuel-saving technique out of thin air. The aeronautical engineers at Lockheed and Allison had understood these exact cruise control parameters theoretically for years. The math was always there. The true friction was a massive systemic communication breakdown between the civilian designers who built the aircraft and the military academies that trained the pilots. Obsessed with preventing catastrophic engine blowouts in the hands of green aviation cadets, the Army Air Forces had intentionally forbidden running engines at low RPM and high manifold pressure. Out of extreme caution, the military bureaucracy had fundamentally handicapped its own frontline fighters. Lindbergh's defining contribution in the Pacific was not a sudden stroke of mechanical invention. It was his willingness to take the extreme physical risk of validating the math in an active combat zone, breaking a deeply entrenched psychological barrier for veteran pilots who would have never trusted a revised technical order from a desk in Washington. But the command staff's worst fears regarding their civilian instructor finally materialized in the skies near Ceram Island on July 28, 1944. Flying a P-38 in formation with the 433rd Fighter Squadron, Lindbergh encountered a Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-51, an aircraft the Allies codenamed Sonia. The civilian observer, legally barred from engaging the enemy, did not break off. Instead, he armed his 4 50-caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon. In a rapid, head-on pass, Lindbergh opened fire, sending a concentrated burst directly into the Japanese plane. The Sonia rolled sharply and plummeted into the ocean below. The politically toxic 42-year-old technical representative had just shot down an enemy aircraft. When the gun camera footage and mission reports reached headquarters, the reaction was sheer panic. It was one thing for General George Kenney to look the other way while a famous civilian tweaked engine settings. It was an entirely different crisis when that same civilian began acting as a vigilante fighter pilot. If the Roosevelt administration discovered that Lindbergh was actively shooting at the Japanese military, the political fallout would have severely damaged General Douglas MacArthur's command. The unofficial arrangement had to end immediately. MacArthur and Kenney were forced to quietly but firmly ground Lindbergh, explicitly ordering him to cease all combat flying before the press or the White House could uncover the incident. The controversial aviator was decisively sidelined, his unauthorized frontline career abruptly finished. Yet the mathematical formulas and radical throttle settings he left behind remained. He had shattered the operational deadlock, and those crucial numbers were about to be put to the ultimate test across the absolute longest stretches of the Pacific. That test arrived in the late summer and early fall of 1944, as General Kenney unleashed his 5th Air Force against 2 of the most distant, heavily fortified targets in the Pacific, the sprawling Japanese oil refineries at Balikpapan, Borneo, and the island fortress of Mindanao in the Philippines. These strikes required round-trip flights of 12 to 1,600 miles over trackless, featureless ocean. Previously, sending fighter planes on missions of this magnitude was considered a mechanical impossibility and a strategic suicide mission. Now, entire squadrons of Lockheed Lightnings were being tasked to escort B-24 Liberators into the absolute limits of their physical endurance. The sheer human toll of these deep penetration strikes was staggering. The P-38 was a lethal combat machine, but it was not designed for comfort. To execute Lindbergh's fuel management formulas, a young Army aviator had to strap himself into a cramped, uninsulated cockpit barely wider than his shoulders and sit virtually motionless for up to 9 agonizing hours. There was no autopilot, no relief tube, and no room to stretch. Pilots baked in the greenhouse heat of the tropical sun at lower altitudes and froze in sub-zero temperatures as they climbed to escort the heavy bombers. Worse than the physical pain was the psychological torture of the mission. For 4 straight hours on the outbound leg, these pilots had to listen to the unnatural, sluggish thrum of their twin Allison engines barely turning at 1,600 revolutions per minute. Every vibration shooting up through the control yoke felt like the prelude to a catastrophic mechanical failure. They were flying hundreds of miles beyond the reach of any Allied rescue boat, entirely dependent on a civilian's unorthodox equation. The ocean below was a dark, boundless void, ready to swallow any plane that miscalculated its mixture settings by even a fraction of an inch. When the American formations finally materialized over places like Balikpapan, the shock of the Japanese defenders was absolute. Enemy fighters, scrambling to intercept what they assumed were unescorted bombers, suddenly found themselves staring down the guns of heavily armed Lightnings. For 15 violent minutes, the P-38 pilots shoved their throttles forward, burning fuel at massive, combat emergency rates as they tore through the Japanese interceptors and protected the Liberators. But the moment the bombers turned for home, the adrenaline evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating dread. The fighter pilots had to immediately dial their engines back down into the extreme lean configurations, locking their eyes on fuel gauges that were already hovering dangerously near empty. The return flights were silent, nerve-wracking exercises in pure mechanical starvation. As the surviving squadrons finally broke through the tropical weather fronts and spotted the crushed coral runways of their home bases, their fuel cells were virtually bone dry. Planes touched down and routinely sputtered to a halt halfway down the airstrip, their engines completely starved of aviation gas. Pilots were so exhausted they had to be physically lifted from their cockpits, their muscles cramped and their flight suits soaked in sweat. Yet they had survived, and the bombers had survived. The gamble had paid off with undeniable finality. By successfully pushing their complex machines to the very edge of failure and returning victorious, the veteran pilots of the 5th Air Force validated a difficult truth. The greatest obstacle holding back the American advance across the Pacific had never been the vast distances, the unpredictable weather, or even the Imperial Japanese military. The most insurmountable barrier had been the rigid, self-imposed rules the Americans had written for themselves. This complex, high-stakes engineering puzzle brings us back to the improbable image of the civilian who first climbed into that Biak Island cockpit. To the political establishment in Washington, Charles Lindbergh remained a disgraced isolationist, a pre-war icon who had irrevocably shattered his reputation with inflammatory rhetoric. Yet, through a singular twist of bureaucratic fate, this outcast bypassed the Pentagon hierarchy to deliver a critical tactical advantage directly to the front lines. Without ever holding a Pacific command or possessing official combat authorization, Lindbergh effectively gave the 5th Air Force the reach it desperately required to dismantle the Japanese defensive perimeter. His 90-day deployment remains a profound historical anomaly, a moment when the rigid architecture of industrial warfare was forced to bend to the will of the solitary, methodical engineer. By validating the complex physics of engine management under fire, Lindbergh proved that the actual limits of American technology were far beyond what the conservative operating manuals dictated. This intervention exposes the defining paradox of the mechanized air war in the Pacific. Victory on this unprecedented geographical scale was not determined merely by the raw manufacturing output of American factories or the theoretical specifications of their machines. True strategic superiority was achieved only by the willingness of combat pilots to aggressively question, defy, and ultimately break the very rules written to protect them. This story of the mechanical exile reveals that in the collision between unforgiving logistics and entrenched military dogma, the most crucial innovation was not a new weapon, but a different way of thinking. The United States military had mobilized its entire industrial base, spending millions of dollars to develop and deploy high-performance fighters capable of crossing the vast, unforgiving expanses of the Pacific. Yet, despite all that overwhelming manufacturing might and theoretical engineering, it ultimately took a politically exiled civilian outcast to step onto a coral airstrip and show combat-hardened veterans how to actually read their own fuel gauges. In the end, the most decisive tactical upgrade the Lockheed P-38 Lightning ever received during the Second World War was not a larger drop tank, a more powerful engine, or a redesigned airframe. It was simply a courageous mathematical adjustment to the throttle that finally unlocked the ocean.